studio lights were blinding, cameras rolling, and the hum of the live audience filled the room like a vibrating wave. Steve Harvey, the legendary host known for his quick wit, booming laugh, and lightning-fast comebacks, was in his element. He leaned forward in his chair, adjusting his tie with a grin, ready to deliver his usual brand of humor. The audience cheered, clapped, and laughed even before the show officially began, because when Steve was on, they knew something unforgettable was about to happen. But today was different. Very different. From the corner of the studio, Jonathan Roumie entered quietly. No entourage, no flashy clothes, no exaggerated smile, just a calm presence that somehow made the bustling, chaotic studio feel suddenly still. He wore a simple shirt, well, fitted but unassuming, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that didn't need applause, the kind of confidence that makes everyone else in the room pause without even realizing it. Steve started with his usual energy. "Ladies and gentlemen,
We've got a very special guest today."
the audience erupted in cheers, unaware that what was about to happen would make this episode one of the most memorable in live TV history. Steve flashed his signature grin, ready to tease, to joke, to charm, but then Jonathan spoke. It was subtle at first, just a few words, but the calm, deliberate tone in his voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Jesus is not just a story," Jonathan said softly, yet with such conviction that it felt like the words carried their own weight. "He is a presence that changes lives, even the ones who think they already know everything." The audience murmured, but Steve Harvey mid-laugh froze. His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his usually unshakable face. He opened his mouth to respond with a joke, to lighten the mood as he always did, but the words never came out. His hand hovered awkwardly over the desk. The studio laughter felt distant now, like it belonged to someone else. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every millisecond of this unexpected pause. For the first time, the seasoned host wasn't in control. And everyone watching at home, millions of them, felt it. You could almost hear the collective pause of the audience through the screen. Something profound had just happened, and Steve Harvey had no script, no punchline, no escape. Jonathan's gaze was calm, steady, almost serene, as if he had done this hundreds of times, but still found awe in the simple act of speaking truth. "Words can be powerful," he continued, "but presence can change hearts instantly." He looked directly at Steve, and for a fleeting moment, the humor and bravado that defined the host seemed to melt away. Steve's usual charm, his jokes, even his quick-fire reactions, all of it paused mid-air. He had literally forgotten he was live. The audience noticed it immediately. The co-hosts whispered to each other. Camera operators zoomed in, capturing the stunned expression on Steve's face. Even the crew in the back couldn't hide their surprise. Social media would later explode with clips of this exact moment, millions of views, thousands of comments repeating the same disbelief. Did Steve Harvey just forget he was live? Steve shifted in his chair, cleared his throat, and tried to laugh, but it sounded different, strained, human, vulnerable. In that moment, the studio wasn't about ratings, celebrity, or jokes. It was about truth, about someone's words landing so perfectly that even the funniest man in America couldn't react in his usual way. And just like that, the tone of the entire show changed. A normal celebrity segment had become something unforgettable, something that would be talked about for years. Because when Jonathan Roumie spoke about Jesus that day, it wasn't just a statement, it was a moment that paused a world. Class entertainer in his tracks right there, live on air. The audience leaned forward. Steve Harvey blinked slowly, trying to process. And in that pause, the magic of live TV revealed itself sometimes. The truth doesn't just speak. It stops you in your tracks. The studio had barely recovered from the initial pause when Jonathan Roumie quietly moved into position for the interview. The set, usually buzzing with energy, seemed to recognize something different about him. Steve Harvey, now more cautious than usual, straightened in his chair and tried to regain his composure. He flashed his trademark smile, a little forced this time, and gestured toward his guest. "Well, Jonathan, welcome to the show," he said, his voice steady but tinged with curiosity. The audience clapped politely, some still whispering about the weight in Roumie's words. Jonathan nodded politely, his calm demeanor in stark contrast to the chaotic energy of the live broadcast. "Thank you, Steve," he replied softly. "It's an honor to be here." Steve leaned forward, resting both elbows on the desk, trying to break the tension with his usual charm. "Now you're known for some pretty incredible roles, but today, I want to talk about something different, something deeper. Tell me, What drew you to portray Jesus in a way that's, let's just say, unforgettable? Jonathan's gaze didn't waver. Steve, I've always believed that our stories on screen are a reflection of the stories we carry in our hearts. Jesus isn't just a character to play. He's a presence that speaks to people in ways words sometimes can't capture. The audience shifted in their seats. Some leaned closer, curious. Others whispered to their neighbors, sensing the shift in energy. Steve, always quick with a quip, paused longer than usual. Normally, he'd fire off a joke here, something to keep the mood light. But the words seemed to hover in the air unshakable. Presence, huh? Steve said carefully, choosing his words with deliberate care. That's powerful. And, I've been on stage a lot, met a lot of folks, done a lot of interviews, and I gotta admit, sometimes I forget what real presence looks like. Maybe I need a lesson from you today. Jonathan smiled faintly, but there was a depth in his eyes that made the smile feel like more than politeness. It was a quiet confidence, the kind of assurance that comes from someone who has spent years honing not just a craft but a purpose. Steve, it's not a lesson, he said softly. It's a reminder that humility, sincerity, and truth have a way of reaching people, even those who think they've seen it all. Steve blinked, caught off guard again. He leaned back in his chair, adjusting his tie, and chuckled nervously. Man, you got me thinking already. I didn't even realize this was a deep conversation. I thought we were just going to have some fun here. But it wasn't just fun anymore. The live audience had picked up on it. The energy shifted from casual excitement to focused attention. People leaned forward, some recording discreetly on their phones, sensing a moment that could go viral. Social media would later buzz with clips from this very segment, highlighting Steve Harvey's rare vulnerability. Jonathan continued, his voice calm but resonant. Steve, when we speak about faith, about hope, about truth, it's not about impressing anyone. It's about connecting. It's about letting words and actions align in a way that changes hearts. And sometimes, the simplest words carry the heaviest weight. Steve's laughter had disappeared completely now. His fingers tapped nervously on the desk as he processed the gravity of the moment. This wasn't just an interview. It was a mirror held up to him in real time, live on national television. The seasoned host, known for keeping control in every situation, found himself feeling something he hadn't expected: awe. The cameraman captured every subtle shift, the narrowing of his eyes, the slight slump in his shoulders, the way his usual swagger seemed tempered by genuine reflection. Even the co-hosts, sitting nearby, exchanged glances, realizing they were witnessing something rare. A Hollywood actor on live TV had just reminded one of the most confident, humorous men on the planet of the power of presence and humility. Jonathan leaned slightly forward, as if sharing a quiet secret with everyone in the room. And Steve, sometimes, the world teaches us lessons through the people we least expect. It's not about applause, ratings, or fame. It's about truth. And truth doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. It shows up quietly, and when it does, it demands your attention. Steve swallowed hard. He wanted to respond with a joke, something to lighten the air, but he couldn't. Not yet. For the first time, he was listening before reacting. The audience felt the tension, a mix of reverence and curiosity filling the studio. They were witnessing a rare, human moment where celebrity met genuine presence. Steve finally said, exhaling slowly, I don't even know what to say right now. I've interviewed thousands of people, but man, that hit different. He chuckled, but it was a quiet, reflective chuckle, not his usual booming laughter. Jonathan nodded. Sometimes, Steve, it's not about what you say next. It's about what you allow yourself to feel in the moment. The pause, the reflection, that's where growth begins. The studio was silent for a beat. Then the audience began to clap softly, not the usual cheer, but the kind of respectful applause reserved for moments that feel sacred even in a noisy, televised environment. Steve Harvey looked around, caught between his natural showmanship and the humility he suddenly recognized in himself. And in that silence, the stage was set for something even bigger, a moment that would make Steve forget the cameras, forget the jokes, and forget, if only for a heartbeat, that he was live on television. Because in the presence of Jonathan Roumie, something extraordinary was quietly unfolding, a lesson in respect, humility, and the kind of truth that leaves even the most confident people momentarily speechless. The studio was electric, yet silent in the same moment. Steve Harvey, usually quick with humor and rapid-fire comebacks, was caught mid-thought. His mind raced, trying to grasp the weight of Jonathan Roumie's words. Every word about Jesus, every calm pause, had chipped away at the confident persona he carried so effortlessly on screen. The humor, the jokes, even the booming voice he used to command attention, all of it seemed irrelevant now. The audience noticed immediately. Whispers rippled through the seats, as if they were sharing a secret they didn't fully understand. Some leaned forward, their phones already recording.
Did you see that?
One whispered. Steve Harvey, he's frozen. Cameras captured every micro-expression, the raised eyebrows, the slight parting of his lips, the way his hands fidgeted on the desk. Jonathan Roumie didn't move. He stayed composed, his gaze steady and unwavering, but his calmness only amplified the tension. Every word he spoke carried weight, but it wasn't aggressive. It wasn't demanding. It was presence itself, quiet, powerful, undeniable. Steve, Jonathan began, his voice softer now, almost intimate in tone. I'm not here to shock you or the audience. I'm here to remind us all that sometimes, the moments that matter most are the ones that stop us in our tracks. Steve exhaled slowly, trying to regain control. Normally, he would have laughed, cracked a joke, or redirected the conversation. But nothing came. His eyes darted to the teleprompter, to the crew, even to the audience, hoping for some cue, anything, that would let him return to his comfort zone. He opened his mouth, attempted a witty comment, but it caught in his throat. The studio held its collective breath. He was trying, but the words he usually wielded with ease seemed foreign now. He wanted to deflect, to entertain, to make the moment light, but the sincerity in Roumie's presence left no room for humor. Jonathan continued, undisturbed by the silence. We live in a world that often rewards noise and performance, he said gently, but truth, faith, and integrity they don't shout. They demand attention not by volume, but by depth. They stop people in their tracks. Sometimes even the people who think they've seen it all. Steve's face changed in ways cameras rarely captured. The corners of his mouth twitched nervously. His eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but with the sudden realization that he was being confronted with something larger than entertainment. A lesson. A moment of humility. And it was happening live, with millions watching. He tried again to speak. Well, his voice faltered. He laughed nervously, but it sounded hollow, almost foreign. I mean, that's deep. Roumie nodded, letting the statement hang in the air. The audience, sensing the shift, erupted in a mix of murmurs, applause, and camera clicks. Something rare was happening. The comic genius of Steve Harvey was being humanized in real time, and it was mesmerizing to watch. The co-hosts exchanged glances, uncertain whether to intervene or let the moment unfold. Steve's body language said it all, his usual bravado replaced by introspection, his rapid-fire energy replaced by a contemplative stillness. For once, he wasn't the one controlling the narrative. He was reacting to it. Jonathan leaned in slightly, his tone calm but pointed. And that's the thing about presence, Steve. Sometimes, the person you think you are isn't enough. Sometimes you're reminded by words, by people, by moments that there's something bigger than you, something worth pausing for, something worth listening to. Steve's eyes softened, his fingers, which had tapped nervously on the desk moments ago, stilled completely. He looked around the studio, taking in the audience, the cameras, the set, then back at Jonathan. For the first time in his career, the line between celebrity and humanity blurred. He wasn't performing. He wasn't entertaining. He was listening. And listening was hard. The audience erupted in a hush of appreciation, as if the silence itself had weight. Even the production crew, hidden behind cameras and monitors, felt the gravity of the moment. Social media would later capture this exact segment, with fans commenting, Steve Harvey was speechless. I've never seen him like this. Steve finally spoke, his voice low and reflective. Man, I don't know what to say. I wasn't expecting that. I mean, I talked to a lot of people, but wow, that hit me in a way I wasn't ready for. Jonathan smiled, a subtle, calm acknowledgement. That's the point. Moments like this aren't about preparation. They're about impact. And today, this moment matters. For the first time in the live broadcast, Steve Harvey was not the showman. He was human, exposed, humbled, and utterly captivated by someone else's quiet presence. The tension, the conflict, the curiosity, all of it had reached its peak. And the audience, watching live or from home, could feel it. Because sometimes the most powerful conflict isn't loud. It doesn't involve anger, confrontation, or drama. Sometimes it's a stillness, a pause, a moment where words stop you in your tracks and leave you completely changed. For a long moment, the studio was suspended in silence. Steve Harvey, the man who could command laughter and attention with a single glance, sat frozen in his chair, His eyes, usually sparkling with humor, were wide, reflecting a mixture of awe and uncertainty. The audience held their breath, caught in the tension of a moment that was anything but ordinary. Jonathan Roumie remained calm, composed, and deliberate. His words had landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through the air. He wasn't performing. He wasn't acting for the cameras. He was simply being present, and that presence had a gravitational pull even the famously quick-witted Steve Harvey couldn't escape. The audience shifted nervously in their seats. Some whispered, some gasped softly, others stared in disbelief. For the first time in years, the man who could improvise any joke, the man whose charisma dominated screens, had no script to follow. Steve's usual playful energy had been replaced with a rare vulnerability, and it was mesmerizing. People leaned closer, trying to capture every nuance of his reaction. Steve cleared his throat, attempted a laugh, but it faltered midway. The sound was hollow, unfamiliar, and yet perfectly human. He looked at Jonathan, searching for a hint of a setup, some sign that this was still part of the show. But there was none. Every eye in the studio, and every camera lens trained on him, reflected the same truth: this was real. Even the co-hosts, usually quick to interject with jokes or commentary, hesitated. They exchanged subtle glances, silently acknowledging the gravity of what was unfolding. A live audience, a television crew, and millions of viewers at home were witnessing a rare, almost sacred moment. The usually unstoppable Steve Harvey humbled by words, by presence, by sincerity. Jonathan leaned in slightly, his calm gaze never leaving Steve's face. "Moments like these," he said softly, "aren't about entertainment. They're about reflection. They're about stopping, noticing, and understanding something bigger than ourselves." The words hit Steve like a gentle but firm hand on the shoulder. His hands, which had been fidgeting nervously, stilled completely. He exhaled slowly, almost as if he'd been holding his breath for the past few minutes without realizing it. His eyes softened, and for the first time that day, the signature humor seemed secondary to something deeper: recognition, understanding, humility. Across the studio, the audience began to murmur, a ripple of emotion passing through the crowd. Phones came out. People recorded discreetly, not wanting to miss the moment when Steve Harvey, legendary, charismatic, untouchable, was humanized on live television. Social media feeds would later explode with clips from this very segment, viewers commenting, "I've never seen Steve Harvey like this," speechless. "He's listening." Steve shifted in his chair, his gaze moving slowly from Jonathan to the audience, taking in every face, every expression. It was as if he was seeing the world in a slightly different light, slower, more thoughtful, more aware. The weight of what Jonathan had said wasn't lost on him. He opened his mouth to speak, but words failed him again. The laughter he usually wielded like a weapon had vanished, replaced with a rare and sincere quiet. He nodded slowly, acknowledging the impact of the moment without overthinking it. Sometimes, a nod could speak louder than any punchline. Jonathan continued, gently, "Presence is not about being seen, it's about being felt. And sometimes, the people who think they are watching the world are the ones being watched themselves, even by the smallest of truths." Steve's eyes glistened slightly, not tears, but the kind of awareness that leaves an imprint on your soul. He leaned back, letting the moment wash over him. For the first time in a live broadcast, he wasn't entertaining anyone. He was being transformed by a quiet, steady truth delivered with humility and grace. Even the crew behind the cameras seemed to pause. Directors, producers, cameramen, everyone was aware that this was no ordinary segment. This was something bigger than a show, bigger than ratings, bigger than jokes. This was a moment that would stay etched in their memories long after the cameras stopped rolling. Then, the audience clapped softly, a measured, respectful applause. Not the typical wild cheer of a TV show, but a recognition of something profound. People at home watching from their couches leaned forward, mesmerized by Steve Harvey's reaction. Comments poured in, "Hey, forgot he was live," because he was truly listening. Steve Harvey finally spoke, his voice calm and deliberate. "Men, I wasn't expecting that. I came here to have some fun, but wow. That hit me in a way I didn't see coming." Jonathan smiled faintly, as if reassuring him that the impact was exactly the point. That's why these moments matter. Not for applause, not for fame, but for truth. And in that moment, the conflict wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic. It was still, profound and transformative, leaving everyone in the studio and millions watching at home fully aware that they had witnessed something extraordinary. The studio was still buzzing, a quiet hum of anticipation and awe hanging in the air. Steve Harvey, usually quick with quips and perfectly timed jokes, remained momentarily silent. His expression had softened, the humor replaced by an unmistakable mix of wonder and reflection. Everyone in the room could feel it, the rare moment when something truly profound lands live, before millions of eyes. Jonathan Roumie's calm demeanor hadn't changed. He looked at Steve with the same quiet intensity. But now there was a subtle shift in the energy, an unspoken understanding that the moment had reached its peak. The audience leaned forward, sensing something monumental was about to happen. Even the cameras seemed to adjust, zooming slightly closer to capture the faces, the pauses, the weight of realization. Steve finally broke the silence, his voice steady but hushed. "Jonathan, I don't know what to say. I've interviewed countless people, laughed at 1,000 stories, but this moment feels different. Like I'm seeing it, really seeing it for the first time." Jonathan nodded, his calm smile never wavering. "Steve, sometimes truth isn't about being loud or flashy. Sometimes it's about presence. About the words and actions that leave you transformed." And then it happened. A subtle commotion at the back of the studio drew everyone's attention. The stage doors opened, and a small group of staff and executives hurried in, holding folders and tablets, their expressions a mixture of urgency and excitement. Cameras swung toward them as murmurs filled the studio. "Steve Harvey, sir," one of the executives said breathlessly. "You need to see this." Steve furrowed his brow, confused. "See what?" The executive handed him a document. As Steve scanned it, his eyes widened. The audience, sensing the change in his demeanor, leaned in closer. The document was simple yet monumental. A letter confirming Jonathan Roumie's involvement in a major charitable initiative, live endorsements, and agreements with organizations Steve respected deeply. But there was one detail that made Steve's jaw drop. Jonathan Roumie wasn't just a guest. He was a visionary behind a movement Steve had unknowingly supported for years. The man he had been speaking with calmly, humbly, and profoundly was a driving force behind initiatives Steve had admired from afar. And more than that, he was someone whose influence extended far beyond the screen. Steve leaned back, stunned. "Wait, Jonathan, you mean you've been?" Jonathan smiled, nodding gently. "I've been working quietly behind the scenes, Steve. Not for recognition, not for applause, but to make a difference. And sometimes, the people you least expect to impact you end up changing everything." The studio erupted, not in laughter, not in cheers, but in a mixture of shock, respect, and awe. Cameras captured every reaction: Steve's disbelief, the audience leaning forward, the co-hosts whispering excitedly, and the production crew silently exchanging amazed glances. It was a revelation that no one could have anticipated. Steve exhaled slowly, shaking his head, a mix of awe and humility.
Man, I've got to admit, I did not see that coming.
"Not for a second. You just wow. I'm speechless." Jonathan stepped closer, still calm, still quiet, yet somehow commanding the attention of everyone present. "Moments like this aren't about fame, Steve. They're about impact. They're about being present when the world needs it most. And today, that presence was felt." The audience clapped softly, the kind of applause reserved for rare, meaningful moments. Steve looked around the studio, finally meeting the eyes of those watching him live, those filming him, those witnessing this unprecedented interaction. He nodded slowly, a genuine smile breaking across his face, one that wasn't rehearsed, staged, or performed. In that moment, Steve Harvey had not just experienced an incredible interview. He had experienced a revelation, a reminder that humility, sincerity, and quiet strength often speak louder than any punchline, and that sometimes the person sitting across from you isn't just a guest. They are a teacher, a mirror, and a force that leaves a lasting mark. The stage, the cameras, the audience, all of it had become secondary. What mattered was the connection, the recognition, and the unspoken truth that had changed everyone in the room. The studio was quiet now, but the energy had shifted completely. Steve Harvey sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly, as if the weight of the revelation had finally settled. The laughter and banter that normally defined the live broadcast were gone, replaced by a reflective silence. He looked across at Jonathan Roumie, whose calm presence seemed to fill the entire space, commanding attention without demanding it. For a moment, Steve simply stared, processing everything he had just experienced. The man he had been prepared to interview as a celebrity guest had transformed into a teacher, a mirror, a force that left him humbled and introspective. The audience could see it in his eyes, the rare vulnerability that no joke could mask, the humility that radiated in place of his usual bravado. Finally, Steve spoke, his voice steady but softer than the booming tone he was known for. Jonathan, I don't even know where to start. I came here ready to entertain, to have fun, to make people laugh, and instead I got a lesson I wasn't ready for. He paused, shaking his head slightly, a genuine smile forming. A lesson that I didn't know I needed, and honestly it hit me harder than anything I've experienced on this stage. Jonathan nodded gently, understanding in his eyes. Steve, it's not about being ready. It's about being present. Life often teaches us through unexpected moments, and the greatest impact comes when we allow ourselves to truly listen and reflect. Steve looked around the studio, glancing at the crew, the co-hosts, and the audience. Even in the midst of live television chaos, the room had shifted. Everyone present had felt the gravity of the moment. Social media would later explode with clips of this segment, viewers sharing the rare glimpse of Steve Harvey not performing, but learning, reflecting, and growing in real time. He turned back to Jonathan, his voice sincere, almost reverent. You know, I've spent decades in front of cameras, talking to thousands of people, making people laugh, but today, you reminded me that it's not about the applause. It's about impact. It's about the moments where you stop and listen, really listen. Jonathan smiled softly. Exactly. And sometimes, the people we least expect to teach us end up leaving the biggest impression. Steve nodded, visibly moved. Man, I get it now. And I think it's more than just me. Everyone watching, everyone in this studio, we all needed to see that. We all needed to pause. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his demeanor calm and reflective. And you know what? I think I want to do something about it. I want to make sure that lesson doesn't end here. That lesson goes forward. Jonathan's eyes met Steve's, calm and approving. That's the right response. Presence, humility, and respect. They're only meaningful when they're acted upon. When the lessons we receive are reflected in the way we live and lead. Steve nodded again, a quiet determination in his expression. I can't change what happened before I got here, but from today I can do better. I can listen more, respect more, and make sure that people aren't just seen for their fame or achievements, but for who they are. The audience clapped softly, some standing, some recording. It wasn't the typical applause of excitement. It was the applause of recognition, of witnessing a rare human transformation on live television. Steve looked around once more, then back at Jonathan, and smiled genuinely. Thank you, Jonathan. Seriously, this is more than an interview. It's a reminder of what really matters, and I hope everyone watching feels that too. Jonathan nodded, his calm smile unwavering. That's the hope, Steve. That's always the hope. As the cameras rolled, Steve sat back quietly, reflecting on the lessons he had just learned. The show would continue. The audience would cheer, and the cameras would keep recording. But for Steve Harvey, and for everyone watching, this moment would remain unforgettable. It was a reminder that true impact comes not from fame, applause, or jokes, but from humility, presence, and the courage to truly listen. The cameras kept rolling, but the studio was no longer just a set for entertainment. Something deeper lingered in the air, a quiet gravity that had transformed the energy of the room. Steve Harvey, the man whose laughter and charisma had dominated screens for decades, sat back in his chair, still processing the profound moment he had just experienced. He wasn't performing anymore. He was reflecting. Jonathan Roumie remained calm, poised, and unwavering, the embodiment of presence that had left a mark on everyone in the room. But it wasn't just the studio that had felt the impact. Millions of viewers at home, watching in real time, were witnessing something rare at a world-famous entertainer humbled, humanized, and inspired in front of their eyes. Steve finally broke the silence, his voice soft but deliberate. You know, I've been on this stage, in front of cameras, with people laughing at my jokes for a long time. But today I've learned something I think matters more than anything I've ever said on air. He paused, letting the words settle. It's that respect, humility, and presence. They're bigger than fame. They're bigger than applause. And they're bigger than anything we can plan or script. The audience nodded and whispered in agreement. The applause that followed wasn't loud or theatrical. It was sincere. It carried the weight of realization, the acknowledgement that they had all witnessed something transformative. Steve looked around the studio, locking eyes with the camera, as if speaking directly to every viewer at home. Think about it, he continued. How often do we judge people by appearances, by fame, or by what we expect them to be? How often do we forget that every person we meet has a story, a purpose, and a presence that can teach us something if we just take the time to notice. Jonathan smiled faintly, the calm authority in his gaze reinforcing the point. Steve, it's simple really. True power isn't in showing off or being admired. True power is in humility, in listening, in respecting others, even when no one is watching. Steve nodded, a genuine smile breaking across his face. And that's the lesson I want to share today. Not just with the people in this studio, but with everyone watching. It's easy to get caught up in ego and fame, in the things we think define us. But the real measure of who we are is how we treat others, especially when we think no one's paying attention. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, speaking directly to the camera. So here's what I want you to do. Respect the people around you. Listen more than you speak. Appreciate the presence of those who cross your path. And never underestimate the power of humility. It can change lives, starting with your own. The audience clapped again, this time louder, some rising to their feet. There was a sense of shared understanding, a recognition that they had all been part of a moment that transcended entertainment. Steve's expression softened as he glanced at Jonathan. Thank you for reminding me that even in a world full of noise, there's power in silence. There's strength in humility, and there's impact in simply being present. Jonathan nodded, his calm smile unwavering. And that, Steve, is how lives change. Quietly, sincerely, meaningfully. Steve looked into the camera one last time, his voice steady and inspiring. If you believe that humility and respect are real strength, type respect in the comments. And tell me where you're watching from. I want to thank every one of you personally for being part of this moment. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the cameras continued rolling, capturing the faces of a transformed host, a humbled audience, and the quiet yet powerful presence of Jonathan Roumie. It was a moment that would live on, not just in clips or social media shares, but in the hearts and minds of everyone who witnessed it. Because true power isn't loud. True respect isn't earned through fame or applause. True strength is quiet, consistent, and lived through the way we treat the people around us, every single day. And that was the lesson everyone, from Steve Harvey to the millions watching at home, would carry long after the cameras stopped rolling.